So we learned that there are these two different, in a chapter before, and we were reminded, maybe it's better to say that there are these two different types of routes, and that different cues kind of differently activate these routes. And it's also important to understand that because both of these routes are somewhat receptive to different types of information. Social psychologists often think about this as kind of like hacking the process into three pieces. Obviously, these three pieces kind of interact with each other often. So one is the sender, one is the message, and one is the audience. I think, as you can easily imagine, it's almost impossible to kind of separate the message from the sender or separate the audience from the message, etc. So all of them interact, but I will kind of keep it with that tradition and trying to just remind you of some of the key influences that these three factors have on the persuasiveness of a message. So let's start with the sender. Who's telling us or who's sending the persuasive message? So there's basically a lot of things that are kind of intuitively important to realize. I think the sender and who the sender is much more important when we process kind of like information on a peripheral route, right? Think about, this is like one of the earliest studies. You probably had that in social psychology last year. And this is about how the attractiveness of the sender is, or here is called the communicator, right, influences a persuasion. What Charlie Shakin found in the study of 1979, and which has been replicated many, many times, is that attractive people are more persuasive than non-attractive people, right? Think about him. He is, I think, arguably very attractive, and so he's more likely to influence us than a person, for instance, if I would sit there and drink the coffee and try to look attractively into the camera. So it matters who's sending it. I think a lot of these things are obvious. If you think about how we form our first impressions of other people, right, there are these two different dimensions that are really important. The first dimension, the most important one, is the other person, a good, trustful person, right? That's the first impression we form of other people. So we would look at George Clooney and say, like, is he is he a good person? And thereafter we ask ourselves if that person is competent or not. And the same is true, right? The higher the competence, the higher the perceived warmth of the other person, of the sender, of the communicator, as it's called here, the more influential that person is. I think one thing that's really interesting, you might have had that when you talk about kind of like if you're doing anything related to health, about how this also works for how learning about, for instance, something like smoking behavior. So there's a real strong indicator that basically seeing attractive people smoke predicts if adolescents thereafter try something, try smoking and start smoking. So there's like, as good as it gets, there's some almost causal evidence for that. So the WHO, right, the World Health Organization, calls for smoking bans in films. I think Netflix has really run it. You don't see much smoking anymore in these movies based on these findings that basically young people, when they see attractive and cool people they admire, smoke, they feel more inclined to smoke too. But this is not everyone. There's a really interesting study where they show that basically Black American adolescents watch more movies, yes, but are less likely to smoke. It seemed like when they watch a Hollywood movie and when somebody smoked in there, they did not feel tempted to start smoking, whereas a white teenager would see somebody and they would feel tempted to start smoking thereafter. Why is that? And that's like basically due to another phenomenon about the source, and that has to do with how similar is the source that is sending it to me. So for instance, think about a Hollywood movie. Think about the person here on the left. I forgot her name. This actress, she is white, so she sees they feel more similar to each other. Hence, he feels tempted to eat. That's me just trying thinking about food, tempted to smoke. But for him, there's a lack of similarity between the two, and hence he does not feel persuaded by her smoking. Yet, if he would see somebody, and this is what they show here in this study, if you're exposed to black male and female heroes or protagonists in movies, then he feels tempted too. So there's a real powerful impact that similarity has on the persuasiveness of a message. If you think about your intervention, you really have to think hard about who's coming in and talking this, especially if we think about teenagers and if you want to change something, or about young people. How similar is that person to them? How much do they like them and value their competence? All right, so we talked a little bit about the source, and it's really important to think about who's sending the message. But obviously, it's important to think about what is the message that you're sending. It's not that you can just bring somebody in who's very attractive and who is also in other ways just like you. No, you need also to have a good message. So what do we know about the message? The thing that is most studied is basically whether fear works or not. So this is a discussion between Dr. Carson. He ran for president. He wanted to be the Republican nominee 2016 to be nominated for to be the presidential candidate. He lost eventually against Donald Trump, who 2016 then became president. But in this debate, and you can watch it, I think the link is in the slides below, they talk about autism. So Dr. Carson, you might not know him, he's a neurosurgeon, a pediatric neurosurgeon. So he operates literally on the brains of children. He's a doctor, highly intelligent person. Otherwise, he wouldn't be what he is. And he has medical know-how. So the commentator asked him, hey, Dr. Carson, what do you think about Donald Trump not believing the scientific evidence that there's no connection between autism and vaccinations? And so Dr. Carson, what he says is like, well, I think there are hundreds of studies now that show it, and I believe that Donald Trump is an intelligent person and he can read the scientific evidence, and then if he reads it, he will form an impression, and I think that that impression will be in line with the empirical evidence available to him. Something like that, but that's not exactly that, but very similar. And obviously, he's trying to appeal to a central route. I'm not sure if that's the right environment to do so. And what does Donald Trump do? He's like, well, I don't know about science and all that, but I know that autism is a pandemic. It's everywhere. It's rising. It's crazy. I have friends, they have a little baby, and they're just a little beautiful baby girl. And with this little beautiful baby girl, they went to the doctor and they vaccinated, and it looked like it was something for a horse, but it was actually for a baby. And 3 days later, the baby had a flu and it was crying and coughing, and then a month later it was diagnosed to have autism. So I don't know about the science, but this is what I know. Obviously, what he's trying to do is he says, I don't care about any of your science nonsense. All I care about is instilling fear. So a lot of people were asking, is this actually kind of like a good strategy? And I'll come back to that. But let's say I threaten you a little bit. Think about this question. How likely do you think it is that you will get cancer in your lifetime, right? So this is a question I like to ask in my research, alongside 40 to 80 similar questions about less severe and similar severe negative life events. How likely do you think it is that you will get cancer, any type of cancer in your lifetime? Okay. Think about it. Put a number in here. I think maybe, what is my number? I think maybe it's 80%. Okay. Not sure. And then, okay, you might think something different. And then I tell you here, this is the Office of National Statistics in the UK, says 53%. So there's a 1 in 2 chance that I will get cancer in my lifetime. And I'm afraid the same might be true for you. And then I ask you, what do you think now is the likelihood that you will get cancer? And you think, okay, I don't know, I put 80 in beforehand, so maybe I got 53, it's pretty good, so I say now 55, okay? So I can basically now have a 55. So in my case, what I got is what we call good news, right? I thought about a negative life event, I saw it at 80, here it is 70, and now I learned that that negative life event is less likely to happen to me than I previously thought, and now I reduce my estimate. So what you can measure here again is the change between this, and this tells you how much they updated their belief, how much the information influenced them. But there's also the case you might thought like 40%, no chance that I get cancer in my life, or just a 40% chance, and then you get bad news. You get threatening information that might not make you feel very good. You're like, it's actually more likely than I thought that I get cancer. Okay, and now you update, and maybe you just update a little bit. Maybe it's like, I hope this doesn't really apply to me. And this is basically what we find in our study. This is a paradigm that was developed by Tali Sharot and has been done. I literally did this. I did this with thousands of people. And what we always find is a difference between good news and bad news, how people incorporate that, okay? So here's the threatening information. Here's the non-threatening information to come back. Does threats help? And here's basically a degree of how much you're influenced. The higher a number, the more you're influenced by this message. And what we find in this study and many, many other studies is that people are less likely to be influenced by bad news than their good news. Maybe you remember my talk about this in the first year. That would be lovely, but it's a very robust finding. So people are actually less likely to change what they think after they're hearing threatening information than non-threatening information. And Tali can show in her research that basically similar to what I showed you in chapter 2 about what the brain does, tracking information, that basically the brain is very well engaged. Here the inferior frontal gyrus on the left. There are also some subcortical regions involved in that, in tracking the positive information, but there's a relatively meager information tracking in the right inferior frontal gyrus and a lack of subcortical regions. Hence our brain kind of shuts down when it is threatened, and it's not very likely to do so. There's a large discussions about it. There were early on research that showed that basically threatening people to change their attitude has opposite effects, backfires. So if I often think of this example, when you see people who go and get threatened about their smoking, they feel stressed. It's like, you will die if you continue to smoke. Look at this. There's it's like every year these many people are dying of smoking in the UK. So I feel really stressed. What does a smoker do when they get stressed? They go out and smoke a cigarette. So often these effects backfire. Yet there are other areas, and you can read this in this meta-analysis, where fear actually works. Where some areas, for instance, it seems like in areas such as climate change, this might work. I think it's important to see that there are now also other routes to do this. So there's one study, I don't want to recap it here. They have basically a funny weatherman delivering messages about climate change. And they also find in this study that humor can influence positively these messages. So it's not just fear, it's humor. Others now have a really strong interest to kind of change the perception of climate change and turning fear into hopeful messages, so using hope in order to inspire a change. And I think both of these messages both of these attempts are proven to work, and they're often nicer to deliver for the person who has to do that for the message. Lastly, let's talk quickly about the audience. So what do you have to think about when you think about who are you giving that, right? I think the key idea here is, right, or the key idea of the audience is that there's that the audience might differ in their tendency to whether they want to use the peripheral or the central route, and also what kind of characteristics they bring into the table. So in my study, right, with the agree or disagree, here you basically see that depending on what kind of belief I have, depending on whether I think this is, for instance, I think it's higher, okay, and you think it's, and we agree on that, so we have a matched beliefs, that's when the person is really influential. But if our beliefs do not match, then the person is absolutely not influential, right? So you have to think about the people you're addressing to, okay, what are the beliefs they have? Another really important one is how much information or knowledge do they have on a topic. So in the early research in social psychology, the often male protagonists of this research, or the people who do, like the experimenters and scientists, they would find that women are less more likely to be influenced, for instance, by attractive others than men. It seemed like that women were more easily influenceable. And I think that might have kind of resonated with the male researchers. There's also Shelley Shakin found the same, and she was female, so it's not just males. But once people dug a little bit deeper in it, what they found is that often the topics that were used were really topics where men had a lot of pre-existing knowledge and women did not have a pre-existing knowledge. So let's say here, stereotypically, they would have a study about cars, and he was like, well, we don't know much about cars. Maybe I should trust that person and change my attitude. But then you would have let's say, about nature or about physics or biology, and now women had at least a similar amount of information, and hence they were less influenceable. So it's really important to remember not only what beliefs your audience have, but also what they know already about the topic, what kind of knowledge they bring into, and hence how much you can influence them. There's other research that shows that basically people are kind of different in how they process information. So you will be familiar with all of these approaches, but this is like in social psychology, there's this idea that we are all cognitive misers. We have to somehow reduce the information and uncertainty, information overload that is around us. And we do this by basically using as little effort as possible. And you can also think of this as a kind of individual differences. So some people are really strongly inclined to never use any of their mental capacities, while others do. So some are truly cognitive misers and others less so. Some are really inclined, and there's a strong connection between, to kind of process information in a very judgmental way. Okay, in a judgmental and a very heuristic way. So they are more inclined to use cues or like affect or affective responses to the person in order to let them guide to their judgment. And there are others who are not really connected to this, who are more inclined to use motivated cognition, trying to find ways to reassure that the beliefs they already have are the right ones, right? A reassuring lie over an inconvenient truth. This is how most of us are, but some people have a stronger tendency to stick with that. Lastly, I want to just kind of mention something we talked about when we talked about wise interventions. One of the techniques they often use is basically, instead of trying to persuade somebody, they use something like self-persuasion. You will remember self-persuasion is basically an act of inducing kind of cognitive dissonance and then hoping that the dissonance is resolved in an attitude change. So here you can see these classic studies by Mills and I forget, Aronson and Mills, right? Is it Aronson? Well, I might be wrong. Where they kind of look at how the more embarrassing the ritual is to get into a group, the more you then like the group membership, right? So the classic experiment that is often kind of started as research by Leon Festinger was where some of the participants were invited to participate in this really boring experiment, right? And they have to turn these packs for half an hour. And then in one condition, the experimenter would ask him, could you go outside and lie to these participants that are waiting, tell them it's a really fun study and they should really participate. We have problems with getting participants. I would give you $1 if you do that. And in another condition, he would give people $20. So here, both of these groups would go outside and then they would tell the other participants, "Oi, that was a great study. You should really participate." They would come back and then they were asked to kind of indicate how much they actually enjoyed the study themselves. And what you can see here, there was also a group that I didn't mention where they were not asked to lie. People did not like the task very much. But then you can see that basically in the 20 lie condition, right, there was no cognitive dissonance because they say, yes, I lied to these people, but $20, that is like $80 or $90 now at that time, it's easy to justify that. But if you have to do something where you can't really justify it, you lie to people that the task was really fun, yet you only paid $1, you got only $1 payment for that, then you have cognitive dissonance. And what can you do to reduce that cognitive dissonance? Well, quite simply, you just convince yourself that you actually really like this study. You thought it was so meditative, how you turned these pegs up and down, up and down, up and down. It was really good. You actually quite like it. It wasn't really a lie you told these participants. So now you have the change. And there's something about telling others that's really powerful, right? Think about device interventions. They often have something like an intervention that they're part of the intervention is a component. The saying is believing, where you have to tell others why it is really good, for instance, to do this or that, right? So by telling others, it's not so much that the interventionist tries to make use participants to convince others. No, they know that by telling others, we participate in an act of self-persuasion, often a very powerful act.